Greetings, church family. Summer's upon us. There's so much going on in our world right now. So many forces pushing and pulling us in one direction or another. It's sometimes hard to know what path to take. In this message, we're going to examine that very thing. Which path to take? And what can be expected to happen as a result of taking either the road most chosen or the one least chosen, or perhaps even the road not taken, if I can borrow a phrase from Robert Frost's famous poem with that title. So please join me in the reading of our passage found in Luke chapter 9, verses 18 through 27. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has arisen." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And he said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." I had a co-worker in the mid-1980s who was always looking for an opportunity to strike it rich by seizing on an opportunity that others might not see or might pass by for whatever reason. His father was our boss. Theirs was a good family, church-going folks. Though my friend was a little bit of a rebel at heart, kind of the James Dean type. He hatched a scheme one day and shared it with me at lunchtime. He said he figured out a way to capitalize on the average person's gullibility. He had figured out a way to start a new religion that would fool large numbers of people into giving him money until he got filthy rich. Then he would disappear and spend the rest of his life enjoying his wealth. He took what he called the televangelist model and added a few of his own ideas to it. He seemed pretty excited about it. Behind my friend's scheme was the assumption that by force of will and cleverness, he could take steps to bring about a certain outcome, as if he could control not only people, but circumstances. Well, after laying out his plan, he asked me what I thought about it. I have to admit it was pretty clever. Well, I was a new Christian at the time, so I didn't have much of a foundation from which to respond. But a verse in the Bible popped into my head. So my response was to quote Scripture. And I said, What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? He just looked at me. Not a cold stare, but it clearly threw him off guard. He never brought it up again after that. A few years later, he was married, had a son. He was an active member of a local congregation, local church. A full-on, outspoken follower of Jesus. The self-help industry has been with us for many years now. At its heart is the belief that a person can learn to take power and control of their own life in such a way as to become something more than what they are. You can become your ideal self. You can reach your full potential by shedding negative thinking and taking responsibility for your own thoughts, your own feelings, and your own actions. You are both your own worst enemy and your own best friend all at the same time. So it's up to you to take control. Think and grow rich. Well, of course, there really is something to all that. Taking responsibility and refusing to be a victim is absolutely a superior way of thinking. The problem is how easily it can lead to the extreme, even narcissism. It can lead to an extreme sense of self-reliance that often rejects the possibility that you might actually need other resources, other people. Taking responsibility is not the same thing as self-reliance, but we often confuse the two. Too often, it can lead to self-delusion, that not only are you the master of your fate, but that you actually have the power and control to compel your will onto every aspect of your life. Why would you put your trust in someone else when all you have to do is take charge of your own life? The real Achilles heel of this way of thinking is, while you do have control over how and what you think and feel, and how you respond, you have almost no control over external circumstances or other people. No matter how good you get at taking charge of yourself, you'll never master the X factor, the unforeseen consequences of your decisions, the scheming and manipulating that's done by others, or unforeseen circumstances. At best, you can have influence on the potential future, but you cannot control future events and realities. Well, Jesus has something to say about that. Yet again, he is praying alone, as he does several times throughout Luke. Though the disciples were with him, which tells us he was praying privately in their presence. He asks his disciples, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" It's the same question that Herod had in verses 10 through 11. And Jesus receives the same answer. Some are saying he's John the Baptist, some are saying he's Elijah, and others are saying he's some other prophet of old who was arisen. Of course, they're wrong on all accounts. The disciples have been pondering this question for quite some time themselves. So Jesus puts it right out there. Who do you say that I am? Peter answers for the others. He says, "You are the Christ of God." Who is Jesus? There's that question again. It keeps coming up, but now Luke records Jesus finally providing and facilitating a direct, concrete answer to that question. I say facilitating because the answer comes in part from what the crowds say and what Peter says about Jesus' identity. But also, in what Jesus has to say about his ultimate destination on earth. Who is Jesus? It's all but certain that whatever his disciples thought about Jesus when he first called them to follow him, he has been gradually revealing himself to them in some very surprising ways. It's a little clearer what the crowds thought. They already had an expectation, and their expectation was built on the words of Malachi in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6 in the Old Testament. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Many of the people, maybe even the disciples at first, clearly saw Jesus as Elijah, and his ministry has a definite connection to the ministry of Elijah. The only other option they considered was that he was at least one of the prophets of old. Now, we know that it was John the Baptist who fulfilled the prophecy in Malachi. After John's death, some who obviously had not seen Jesus, some speculated that he may be John come back from the dead. But even the disciples knew he couldn't possibly be John the Baptist. Yet, by now, after all they've been witnesses to, the disciples are becoming convinced that Jesus is none of the above. Some, maybe all of them, have reached a more accurate conclusion. They still did not fully grasp everything concerning who the anticipated Messiah would be, or fully comprehend his mission in its entirety. But they are completely convinced that Jesus is the Christ of God, the Messiah of God, the Anointed One, the Holy One of Israel. Jesus had forecast all of this in his hometown synagogue back in chapter 4, verses 16 through 30. He has been demonstrating it daily as while going along about his business in his ministry. Jesus, the Son of Man, the Son of the living God, is in fact God's Christ, sent to bear the sins of the world on the cross, to effect the impossible, salvation, forgiveness of sins. Now they know. What they don't know is the depth and breadth and height of that ministry to the world, to reconcile God and humans. They now know for certain who he is, but do not fully grasp all there is to know about who he is. And Jesus tells them not to tell anyone. Well, not yet. The timing is still not right. We know who he was and is from our position in history, looking back, but there are still a few things that need to happen for the disciples before it can all come out for them. The disciples can know something more than the crowds, than everyone, but they cannot tell anyone. And then Jesus gives them the most amazing preview. It's the first of three major announcements in Luke's gospel. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. In other words, Jesus must take up his cross. He must bear it. Clearly, Jesus knew exactly who he was, what he was doing, and where he was going, and he knew why. He didn't gradually discover it along the way. The disciples gradually discovered it, but Jesus wasn't surprised or blindsided by anything. His experience was gradual. After all, he is living within the framework of time. And time is moving at a steady pace, a set pace. And his knowledge of who he is and what his mission is fully known to him. And then Jesus said to all of them, if anyone, not just the disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Whoever would come after me. Well, aren't the disciples already coming after him? Have they not already denied themselves? Haven't they left everything to follow him? Yes, they have. But the well is so much deeper. Jesus describes a paradox that is beyond profound and yet so clear. Or is it? The answer to the question, who do you say that I am, is linked to the paradox of saving one's own life and how we follow Jesus. If you come to know who the real Jesus is, then you must decide whether you're going to follow him. And then choose the path you take. And how you will take this path. This is the foundation of discipleship. The primary requirement if you're going to follow Jesus. And so the question to us of which path we will follow, saving our own lives but losing our souls on the one hand, versus losing our lives but gaining our salvation on the other. The question is solved by asking the question Jesus asked of his disciples, who do you say that I am? The paradox of verse 24 is the ultimate irony. The surest way to guarantee your own demise is to take the reins of autonomy and by your own effort take action to save yourself. The harder you try and the more you do to effect your own salvation, the more elusive it becomes. And the more it reinforces your death. The more self-defeating it becomes. Self-help doesn't help when it comes to following Jesus. It's repeating the sin of Adam and Eve, thinking that we can become something that we're not. Be more than what we are. Be the masters of our own fate. To be both the cause and effect of our own salvation. This verse is one of the clearest rejections of the idea that you can work your way to heaven, or that there's such a thing as being saved by works. Paul overtly rejected that idea. And here, Jesus outlines the paradox of that idea. The flip side is that by dying to self, rejecting yourself, denying yourself, literally abdicating autonomy, surrendering control, submitting fully to God's power and authority over your life. By doing this, you find life, not death. You gain everything you attempted to accomplish for yourself, but couldn't. That's what Adam and Eve discovered after the fact, when it was too late. For them, the promise in the garden was pyrite, fool's gold. Their sin was not that they merely broke a rule by eating from a tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. No, it's far more insidious than simply breaking a rule. Eating the fruit of that tree was merely a case of opportunity. No, their sin goes to motive and means. They already had life in its fullness, already, in its abundance. They had fellowship, community, a life free of anxiety, free of prejudice, free of envy, free of conflict, a life of ultimate contentment, fulfillment, security, free of oppression, free of fear of sickness, and the ultimate, free of death. They were mortal, that is, it was possible for them to die, but they were in the garden with access to the other tree, the tree of life, so that their life was open-ended and perpetual. So long as they maintained fellowship with God, they had everything that we spend all of our time and energy on our whole lives, trying to obtain for ourselves through self-help. They only knew peace, contentment, joy, happiness. But they rejected the rule and providence of God. Why? How could they throw it all away like that? They had it all in extreme abundance, and yet abandoned paradise for an existence of poverty that ultimately resulted in death. Why would they do that? Because the seed was planted by the serpent that led them to deceive themselves into believing there was more. Yes, more. They already had more than our imaginations could accept would be possible for any human being, regardless of how much money or power or prestige or comfort or luxury that we might accumulate for ourselves. They had more. They threw it all away for a false promise, an expectation that they could be more than what they already were. They believed they could achieve and acquire something they didn't have, as if God was holding out on them, holding them back. They were already learning God. They were already growing, becoming, experiencing God's goodness, and increasing degrees of fulfillment. Well, one of the problems is they didn't have anything to compare it to. They had no idea what it would be like to be hungry, lonely, empty, or afraid. They couldn't possibly conceive of feelings of oppression, inferiority, anger, prejudice, discrimination, or injustice. Did they even have words like danger, disease, envy, hate, greed, or bitterness? The words of God to Adam concerning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die, would be understood only on a theoretical level. But without ever having witnessed death, Adam could barely have understood the full implication of what he was doing. Without the experience of loss and rejection, it would have been a very distant possibility in his mind. They were deceived into believing they could not only have it all, but that they could have more. They could be more, become something they're not. They could become like gods, or like God, or maybe even gods themselves. They could acquire knowledge they do not possess, wisdom that would make them more. And they could do it for themselves. That's the catch. They didn't even need God to become more than what God had made them already. They would increase in knowledge, wisdom, fulfillment. Something new for them was suddenly possible. Self-fulfillment. Self-actualization. It's not that they were dissatisfied with what they had, and it wasn't like they felt anything was lacking or actually missing, but that they discovered there was potentially even more at their fingertips, at their disposal. It was the ultimate expression of autonomy, the ultimate exercise of free will. I can be more than I am. I can do it myself, and I can do it without God. In fact, I can do it like God, as if I myself am God. Oh, that was them, right? That's not you. That's not me, right? Well, here's the thing. I can decide for myself. God never intended us to relinquish choice. Not even in submission are we to surrender our free will. Even in absolute obeisance and surrender, we are still free moral agents. God does not limit our ability or even our desire to choose. He does limit our choices. There are two categories. We will either choose His will, what's good and right, or choose our own will. But because there is no interference by God at all, of any kind, we 100% bear the responsibility for our choices. When Jesus says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it," He's describing Adam and Eve, and He's describing all of us, every single one of us, as we stand like soldiers in the army of the damned, all in the same formation with Adam and Eve and Cain. But not a disciplined army that dominates the battlefield with technical and tactical proficiency, but as a ragtag army in humiliation and defeat. Ultimately, we do not stand at all. The ultimate outcome of your life is directly linked with the present input of your choices. Now. What you do now in response to Jesus directly impacts what Jesus will do in response to you when He returns. How you choose to respond, whether you will give Jesus all that you are, that is, deny yourself, will either result in saving your life or forfeiting your life. Whatever you embrace, whether you embrace your cross daily, that is, your rejection, the opposition that you face, humiliation, maybe even your death because of Him, or whether you are ashamed, that is, you shrink back out of a perceived sense of potential loss, that will determine whether Jesus views you as loss, shame. No amount of gain or profit that you can acquire for yourself in this world can offset the loss that is guaranteed if we do not deny ourselves and accept, embrace our humiliation and suffering for Jesus' sake that lies in wait for all of us. It's a clear choice, without nuance, without loopholes, without exceptions. It is the hard right. The easy wrong is to seek the safety of conformity to the world and allow our fears to outvote the truth. Wouldn't it be nice to have the option of accentuating only the positive? If I could just sell you on all the benefits of following Jesus, the wonderful blessings He promises, the blessed life, where being a Christian is easy and acting like one is optional. But sometimes it's a little inconvenient, isn't it? We think we have covered when we tell ourselves and others we're just trying to achieve balance. Isn't that the healthy thing to do? Achieve balance in our lives? Sorry to break it to you, but when it comes to discipleship, following the real Jesus, who himself was rejected and suffered, an innocent man who was executed, there is no such thing as balance. It's either all in or all out. A temporary, marginal, contingent, half-hearted, convenient faith has one and only one outcome. It's the same outcome as having no faith. It means you are still trying to control your destiny. You are still trying to save your own life. Proverbs 14, verse 12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The way that seems right leads us along everything from atheism, which is the outright rejection of God, to agnosticism, which is uncertainty about God, and all the way to those who claim to be believers, but do not commit their lives to the only one who can save their lives. Hedging your bet seems right. 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in the church seems right. Compartmentalizing your life, separating and segmenting friends from family, from work, from anything, and only giving Jesus a slice seems right. But the end result of anything short of denying yourself and taking up your cross daily is the way of death. If the input is all of self and none of thee, or even some of self and some of thee, then the only outcome you can expect is death. I'm not making this up. None of self and all of thee is the only input that brings about the output, the outcome of life. The opposite of destruction, a shameless, over the top, full steam ahead, embracing the call and all the associated consequences. To follow Jesus without shame, that is the only path to life. If I'm choosing my own way, then the answer to the question, who's the boss? Who's in charge of my life? The answer is me. And if I am the choice, if I'm choosing me as the boss, then choosing is losing. If Jesus is a loss to me, a source of shame, then I am a loss to Jesus. This is tough stuff. It's hard-hitting, I know. I wish I could tell you not to worry about it. Everything's going to be all right. Well, everything is not going to be all right. If you keep going on like you are, as if you are in control, it's not going to end well. On the other hand, if you truly deny yourself and accept the cross waiting for you, then you're accepting some pretty potent, maybe even horrible possibilities. Sometimes following Jesus hurts. Sometimes it hurts a lot. Not following him is going to hurt a lot more than that. It's all about outcomes. What does it profit a person to gain the whole world and lose his soul or her soul? Answer, it doesn't. It's a lose-lose proposition. What does it profit a person to deny himself or herself and take up his cross or her cross daily and follow Jesus? What's the profit? Answer, everything. He is the Christ of God. The real Jesus denied himself and took up his cross. He calls us to deny ourselves and take up our crosses daily and follow him, come after him. Choosing to follow Jesus on his terms is the ultimate expression of our free will. Please join me in saying, I am not ashamed of Jesus. I am not ashamed to follow him and call him my Savior. No matter what the cost, I am not ashamed. Will you bow with me? Our righteous Father, to you we are eternally grateful that Jesus did not shrink back. Father, he completely submitted his will to your will. He denied himself. He embraced his cross, the shame, the suffering, the agony. He bore it, Lord, for us on our behalf. And he asks us, he requires us to examine ourselves, to decide either we're going to follow the real Jesus or we're not. And if we're going to follow him, then let us have the courage to deny ourselves completely, to embrace our cross, to accept our suffering, and follow him. Really follow him. Father, I pray that your Spirit will be in all of us in the hearing of this, and that we will truly deny ourselves, embrace our cross, and follow you. All to your glory and honor. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ.